Welcome to Retro Revisited, and in this video I want to talk to you about Robot Wars. No, not that one. Certainly not that one. This one. A TV show broadcast on the BBC in the late 90s, it saw teams of amateur and professional engineers battling against one another by using contraptions they'd created in their sheds. I loved it when I was a kid, but nostalgia can't blind me to how cringeworthy parts of it were, and even back then, I think we all knew it wasn't the coolest thing in the world. But it certainly had a unique charm, and for my money, was nowhere near as embarrassing as its US equivalent, BattleBots. Interest in the show inevitably waned, of course, and it was cancelled in 2004 after 7 years on the box. But now it's back, with the rebooted iteration being televised in the UK later on this year. So what better time to look back at the titles the show spawned, and surprisingly, there's quite a few. But can they capture the low-grade charm of the battles from the TV series? Do they stand up as enjoyable titles in their own right, or are they merely best-forgotten pieces of fan service? I'll hope to answer all those questions and more in the next few minutes. So let's start with Metal Mayhem for the Game Boy Color. Released in the year 2000, it was developed by Teartex Design, who were also behind Toy Story Racer on the GBC, which boasted some seriously impressive 3D visuals. So I'm sure it managed to make this a technical marvel too. Right? Let's take it for a spin and see.
Activate.
Well, maybe not. What do I need to say here? This is one of those games that you know is bad almost straight away. Laughably shallow combat, robots can't even be flipped over, teamed with awful visuals and a small roster of machines, makes this a flat-out disaster. Oh, and you can win by using this same tactic with the flame pit every time. Brilliant. Things can surely only improve with our next stop though. Arenas of Destruction, released on both the PC and PlayStation 2. And yes, it is better than Metal Mayhem, but sadly that's like saying a tin can is a better robot than a pea. And at least the pea has better manoeuvrability. But let's move away from this metaphor. This is a game that ultimately isn't much fun. I can't summarise it better than that really. First you have to create a robot in a virtual workshop, and from here on in the design errors just start stacking up. It gets off to the worst possible start with some annoying menu screens. You have to listen to the voiceover finish on each one before you're allowed to go to the next. For a game that asks you to wade through pages of options, that's not ideal. The battles themselves aren't much better, possessing a weird, disconcertingly jerky quality. Also, please note how the house robots dash around like they've been chugging a vat of espresso. Another real problem in the arena is how damage is portrayed, with your bot's bodywork simply flaking off in the same way every time, until you're deemed damaged enough to be disqualified. No specific dents or holes are ever created, and for a title focused on destruction, that's pretty unforgivable. The controls aren't too bad though. The tank-like setup, which sees you having to rotate the robot with one stick and move it forward with the other, means you can't move around at any great speed, but in my mind this pretty much emulates how it would be to steer an actual machine in the show. I'll give the developers the benefit of a doubt and say this was an intentional design choice. What really kills the game is how you can't play as any of the machines from the show straight away, however. Instead you have to slowly unlock them through the hugely unforgiving campaign mode, using an inevitably weedy contraption created with the meagre funds available to you. Now you could argue that making you build up your heap of scrap metal so it can eventually compete against the better machines somewhat mirrors how it might be like to be an actual roboteer from the show, but I'm not having that. This is just downright cruelty from the developer. Not all games are fun straight off the bat, admittedly, but having this structure in place for something like this, that's clearly aimed as fan service first and foremost, is just ridiculous. To see how you can avoid making this error, let me give you a suitable example. Say the Godzilla series of titles. They're based around a license that perhaps doesn't have huge mainstream appeal, but there's a dedicated fan base for it out there, like Robot Wars. So in Destroy All Monsters on the GameCube, are you locked out to the same degree as you are in Arenas of Destruction? No, you are not. Sure, You can't play as all the beasts straight away, but you can take control of Godzilla himself, and the process to unlock other characters isn't ridiculously difficult and unfair. You don't have to play as a newt fighting tadpoles or something. But I think you get the point, and I've gone on about this for long enough, so let's move on. Next up is Advanced Destruction for the Game Boy Advance. It's poor, no surprises there, but it's bad in subtly different ways to the titles that have come before it. Which is annoying, as it means I can't just copy and paste previous segments of the script for this part. There's a curious lack of modes here, for example, and the default controls are strange, with the tank-style setup using the A and B buttons instead of the D-pad to rotate your bot. You can change this in the menus of course, but still, it's odd. For the Poultry Positives list, you do have a decent number of robots to choose from, and the battles are better than the ones in Metal Mayhem. Then again, the battles in A Text Adventure are better than the ones in that. Despite the isometric visuals, this is so one-dimensional it hurts, and it would make for a great double bill with Rock'em Sock'em robots. And by great, I mean hellish. Okay, anyone who had played all three of these would definitely be reaching the end of their tether at this stage, so it's perhaps fitting that the last two Robot Wars titles to be released are the best by far. Anyway, the title in question is Extreme Destruction, which was released in two forms, one for the Game Boy Advance and the other for the Xbox and PC. Neither one is a masterpiece, but they do get the least amount of things wrong. What a compliment. The GBA title is built around an ambitious 3D engine that can often feel like you're stuck in a Super FX chip fever dream, for instance. But you can play as all the robots, and there's at least some heft to the combat, helped no end by the crunching sound effects. I'll be completely honest, I don't mind this one. It's nothing special, and it looks a little ropey nowadays, but the battles aren't terrible, if still as deep as a puddle, and there are some enjoyable enough minigames. It gets a pass. The PC and Xbox version is on a similar quality level. From a technical standpoint, it's the best Robot Wars title by quite some distance, with detailed visuals, impressive customization options, and a set of varied arenas. Sadly, it has the same lockout nonsense as Arenas of Destruction, and even though you can put in a password to make everything available, I still feel sorry for the kid that got this for Christmas and would have no idea about such a code existing, having to play for endless hours as Deator to even get a glance of Hypnodisc. In terms of the battles, they still suffer from the same issues I've mentioned before as well, namely unconvincing damage effects and unpredictable CPU opponents that can make some defeats very hard to take. It may look nicer on the surface, and that does make it tolerable for a while, but the same dodgy mechanics are present under the hood. So what have we learnt here? Definitely that Robot Wars titles are generally poor, but it also makes me think that a game based on this license is always doomed to fail. All these titles make their own little and large mistakes, but there's a common problem running through the lot that you might have picked up on: the combat itself. Simply put, the battles are never much fun, at best feeling slightly random, and at their worst, downright unfair. In none of these titles does it ever really feel like you can win bouts through skill alone, with certain elements of the experience completely beyond your control. But, and here's a key point, you could argue this perfectly captures the feeling of the show, even if the developers didn't intend for this to be the case, which I'm almost certain they didn't, considering the raft of poor design choices made across these games. Which brings me on to the almost paradoxical nature of these titles. If you were given more control, with battles being less chaotic and more strategic, would that not make them failures in terms of being interactive interpretations of their source material? It all depends on how much of a Robot Wars devotee you are, of course, but even then it's worth pointing out that these games often fail as fan service too. Being locked out of playing as all the bots, weapons being present that wouldn't be allowed in the show, the unrealistic destruction in the arena, the list goes on. It's hard to see these titles pleasing anyone who grew up watching the show, and it's therefore safe to say that these games irritate and disappoint in almost equal measure. Let's hope that we might get something a little better when the new series airs, but I wouldn't count on it. So to conclude things, unless you're a Robot Wars mega fan, I'd probably give these a miss. Cease. Hey, thanks for watching, I really appreciate it. Sorry this video was so long in the making, but please do throw me a like if you can, and let me know if you played any of these games, and if so, what you made of them.
Feel the burn?